This is Nicholas Alexiou from the Hellenic American Project, Department of Sociology, Queen's College, CUNY, and I'm very happy and pleased and honored to have an oral history interview today with a person of the letters and also an educator, Dr. Stamatis or Stamos Metzidakis, who is a professor emeritus of French and comparative literature. Dr. Stamati Metzidakis, Stamo, welcome to the oral history series of interviews for the Hellenic American Project, and thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start. Give us some ideas about your early background, where you were born, where the family came from, and how was the environment you grew up.
All right. Well, I was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, 1952. Both of my parents were also born in Springfield, but my mother, when she was 3, left the United States because her older brother got killed in a car accident. And my papu almost lost his mind because, he was the only son that he had. And so they went back to Greece. And this was 1927. So my mother was there throughout the Polemo, and she came back after World War II to make money and send it back to Greece. But she met my father here in New York, and they got engaged and they got married, and then they moved back to Springfield, where I was born with my older brother Yanni. And 10 years later, we finally all went back to Greece. So it was the first time my mother had gone back to Greece, and since she had left. And so my father, nobody knew my father in Greece. They had not met him. So the whole way on the boat, he was nervous. He was hoping, how are they gonna like me and all this stuff. And of course, once we got there, we were treated like royalty, and we were there for 4 months, Stachania. So everybody in my mother's family is in Chania. My father's family, Metzidakis, they are all from Little Choria, like in Kukunara and places like that, close to Chania. So everybody's from Western Crete. But, again, I was born in Mass, and I'm officially the 2nd generation. So it's kind of odd because when my mother came back, she didn't speak any English. So my mother tongue is Greek, because that's all she spoke. Then I went to Greek school. Everything was, the Greek community there. St. George community was loving, and everybody we knew was somehow connected either to Greek school, Sunday school, the drum and bugle corps that I was part of. And it was a very loving, very closely knit community. My mother just died about a month ago, and the people from that community were the people who are still alive. They were all there at the funeral. I still feel like it's a megali ikogenia, that I have, thanks to those people. So that was pretty much my childhood. Everything was connected to the church. Everybody was connected to the church.
So this is very unusual to have a 4-month vacation or leave of absence from work. What kind what type of jobs the parents had?
My father would just worked in a factory, in a printing shop, along with lithografos, and along with my uncle Bob, who also worked in the same factory. And he was lucky. They were lucky because his job, his boss, the president of the company, gave them this time off. No pay, I don't think, but they gave them the time off and gave them their jobs back when they came home. And those 4 months were incredible because there wasn't a word of English. So when I came back to the United States, I didn't speak any English. And so my cousin Evangela, he was teaching me English. And the following year, when he went for 4 months, I had to teach him English when he came back to Massachusetts at the end of his trip. So that was a very lovely time. You know, I got to know everybody there, but I was 5 years old. So it wasn't until I was in college in France that I managed to go back to Greece to visit for about a month and a half. And so it was a long period in between my 5 years old and 20. But during all that time, of course, it was still the same situation. I still had the whole Greek community here. And so I never felt like I was completely gone from Greece or for the United States. I always have kind of lived in between the two cultures, the two languages, the two communities.
So it seems that part of your family, especially your father's side, they belong to the early wave of mass immigration when they came here, because your father was born here, you said, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, and also the area you grew up, it was an area with a heavily concentration on the textile industry and other factories. So anyone from the family worked in the textiles?
Yeah, they all did. Both papudes and both yayales who were so the Vlazaki side is my mother's side, and they all came around the same time, like 1910, 1909, and they all went to Massachusetts because of the jobs. And I guess there was some other HELLENIC who sort of served as hosts, and they stayed. My papu Stamos, Vlazakis, he had a restaurant in Springfield, and apparently a very successful one. But again, when this terrible accident happened and his son Yorgos got killed, the weather was too cold. It was, he wasn't, then he hit Nyalatu, and basically he had to leave. The doctor said you could either go to the Southwest, Arizona, or you can go back to Greece. So he said, so and he went back. So that's the way that worked. They were all involved in that first wave, as you say, that first immigration wave.
Working hard, long hours, right, and trying to build up a community, right?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. They built the first. My papu Yanni Metzidakis, he had a Greek produce store, like Titan here in Astoria. And it was the first one in Springfield. So during the Depression, they managed to survive, whereas a lot of businesses didn't. I told you, on the other side, my papu Stamos, he had the restaurant. So that was it. But yeah, most of the people just worked in factories at that time, trying to make enough money to buy a nice house, stay together with the Greeks, and they built a church, and it was a loving community that kept growing, stayed very tight for many, many decades.
So in a sense, you grew up in, first of all, a working class environment, but also an environment that, you behave Greek, you spoke Greek, you listen to Greek music, or reading Greek news from Greece.
That's right, right. Ethnikos Kiriks and all that stuff. Yes, right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And also your friends, they were all Greeks, or you had also non-Greeks, American friends, let's say, growing up?
I would say all of my friends were Greek, but when I got to high school is when I finally started really branching out, because I was a little older, got my license, and I was able to make some more friends in school. And my parents by that time were much more open to all of that kind of thing also. And so my two best friends to this day, I met in high school, and neither one is Greek, but they're very, very close to the family. They were both at the funeral for my mother just recently, and they were they're just part of the family. So that was a lovely thing to realize for everybody, that you know, you didn't have to be Greek to be close to us. But that came later. As I said, that wasn't until I was in junior high school, basically high school. So that's the late 60s we're talking about. I graduated high school in the 1970s. And so at that point, yes, I was still very much part of this monolithic Greek community.
Also, it is very interesting how you decided to study and be a scholar in French literature, which is a very something very paradoxical in American society. I think it is some kind of not negativity, but some kind of reservation towards French culture. Although the Statue of Liberty is a gift by the French government to commemorate the American Revolution and independence, at the same time, in a very general sense, the Americans, they are pro-Anglophone or pro, you know, friendly to British than the French. How come you specialize in teaching French in a very Anglophone environment?
Yes, very, very correct. The first thing is because I was growing up in New England and there was already a great deal of French Canadian influence. Like many of my neighbors were French Canadian. We didn't think much of them back then. We thought they were, you know, sort of not very interesting people. But of course, many years later, I saw, oh my God, look at the history. Look at all that they have to say. So I was already involved there. I was already taking French in school. And in a way, the French business was a way of breaking away a little bit from the Greek culture, but nonetheless also staying away from American culture. So it was like another door that I could walk through that would allow me to be both American and something else. And so for me, you know, it became a third option, you know. I think that my daughter, Katina, who married a Chileno many years later, I think she may have done a similar kind of thing because she already had the French because we lived in France with them as kids. And then she met this guy in Chile when she was studying Spanish. So she has this kind of third way that allowed her to navigate different cultures and languages. And it's kind of interesting that happened that way. So yeah, all of that to say that it wasn't that unusual for me to want to teach French because it was a different kind of, it was like I put on different glasses to see the world differently, but it wasn't the Greek glasses, it was the French glasses. In fact, when I was in the first year I had spent in France, when I was studying at the Sorbonne, I read, you'll like this, I read Alexis Zorbas, the famous Kazantzakis novel in French, not in Greek, not in English. And I felt way more connected suddenly with Greece through the French angle. And I'll always remember that because I told my relatives in CUNY about this. And so when I arrived at Christmas time from Paris, I told you, you know, that Theodorakis was on the same airplane. They gave me a present, which I still have right here next to me, which was a beautiful hardbound copy of Kazantzakis' novel in Greek. And so that's one of my great possessions in the world.
Besides the fact that the general policy is not French friendly, many American authors, they've been to France and Paris, and the expatriates, right? That they live there. They wrote a lot, you know, poets, authors, actors, etc. And also, it was an American bookstore in Paris. Tell us about your experience.
The Shakespeare and Company, right? The Sylvia Beach bookstore. When I first got to France, of course, that was one of the first places I went to in Paris. just to see what was this place. It's still very much alive. It still draws people to this day. I walked in, and at the time, this was 1972, you know, it wasn't nearly as crowded as it is now. Now you go there, you sort of have to wait to get in the door. But it was a lovely place. I mean, you walked in, you immediately knew you were in someplace important. It was like an ecclesia, you know, with books everywhere, and even places where people could sleep if they didn't have a place to sleep. You know, that goes back to Hemingway's time and all that, you know. So I thought that was a remarkable place. It was just down the street from where I was going to school. The only thing about it is that because I was such a maniac about learning French, I tended to stay away from any place where I heard English. I remember telling my students over the years, I said, if you're going to go to France and if you want to learn how to speak French properly, I said, you have to disconnect all of your earphones and all of your connections to the internet and stay away from English. I said, you have to completely accept being by yourself and speaking this other language, or else you're not going to learn it. And, you know, that's one of my big pet peeves over the years that continues to this day. And that is that Americans are not willing, a lot of Americans are not willing to make that kind of sacrifice anymore. They want what they want. They want it now. You know, they want to be on the internet. They want to be this and this, email and all that. And that's not going to widen people's heads. You know, it's not enough to just go there and spend a couple of months as a tourist. You have to try to force yourself into getting into somebody else's life, into somebody else's body. And a lot of Americans are not willing to do that nowadays. I would say there are fewer than ever are willing to do that. And as a result, American education is not stressing languages the way they did in the 60s, because that was part of the Cold War too, right? That they were learning languages because it was important to sort of broaden your horizons. Well, now, after somebody like Trump too, it's like America, 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 and it's nonsense because it's, you know, it just is doing exactly the opposite of what people should be doing, which is to try to open themselves up.
So in 72, while you are in Paris, in Greece, we have the military junta between 1967 and 73, right? 74,
right.
When it ended officially. So, and it was a very strong Greek community there, protesting, creating awareness. Mikis, like you said, was there, and many others, intellectuals and students and artists from Greece, and also here in the States, because Mikis and others came here to make the situation, to aware people about the Greek junta and the need to get rid of it. So how you experience it, especially when you went back to Greece in 72?
Yeah, I did notice there were benefit concerts, there were lectures here and there were different demonstrations against the junta. You know, whenever I could, I would attend as many of those things as possible. As usual, as a poor, starving student, I could only do so much stuff. So I didn't get around the way I might have otherwise or might have liked to. But yeah, I mean, I was certainly aware of what was going on in Greece and how there was this other community of expatriate Greeks there. So whenever I would go into a Greek restaurant or something like that in the so-called Latin Quarter, which is really a Greek quarter now, as you probably know, close to Notre Dame in Paris, I felt very much at home. It was nice to be able to talk to Greeks and stuff, and that was very rewarding, you know.
So when you visited Greece that year, to be an American it was a bit, difficult.
Yeah.
How they treated you as a Greek, as an American, because it was the peak of the resistance. And I don't want to say anti-Americanism, because the Greeks always loved American culture, but against the military.
Sure. Against the CIA.
Presence, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing, as I said before, Exo Americanif, from the American bases. That was right at my tia's house, right in front of the door, and I don't think it was for me in particular, because it was right down the street from Suda Bay and the whole military base. But you're right. I mean, there was a lot of anti-CIA, in particular, sentiment in Greece, and yeah, people treated me just fine because I was Greek, right? Because I spoke Greek, and I was always with my family, so I never experienced any kind of ugliness. But I suspect that if I had gone there and didn't have those connections, it would have probably been harder than it was for me during that time. Otherwise, people were delighted to meet an American that they could actually like, right? Because at that time they weren't all that crazy about Americans.
Also, the area you came from in the States, in Massachusetts, there were some political figures, Greek American political figures, Chorgas, Arbanis, that they were against the military junta. So you knew about the Greek American politicians of that time?
Yeah, a little bit. I was not very political, to tell you the truth, at that time. I was much more interested in kind of aesthetics, at a kind of distance. It wasn't until a few years later, when I was in graduate school, that I suddenly became aware of many more political issues that I should have been involved with and known about. One of my professors, I went to Columbia for my PhD. One of my professors was Edward Said. So you can imagine, with somebody like that, I had to sort of face up to the importance of facing political issues, especially things having to do with American foreign policy. And I did, I never became some kind of radical, political activist, but I definitely became much more aware of it and tried to be involved even at a distance much more.
I wanted more to know about the families that you knew, if your family knew the Greek American politicians, because they also came from a working class background.
Yes.
As you did, right? So the Chongas family was close to your place, right?
Dukakis and everybody, yeah. I mean, all of those people, I saw those people, those prominent Greek Americans. Yeah. I saw them in my church. They came and visited at different points, when they were running for office. It's always very tightly knit, as you know. If you have a Greek one place, there are going to be some other Greeks who are going to come. If you have enough of them, there's going to be a church, and that's the way it is every place that I've been in the world. So there's this constant, quest at getting involved with, ethnos, right? That whole Greek thing, regardless of the extent to which you can do that. There's always this sort of deeply rooted desire to get together and form some sort of community.
And all this time, you felt proud about your background, right? So, do you think that Greek Americans is a, let's say, successful ethnic group in the States? And also, it is because at some point we were considered white. How do you evaluate the Greek American presence in America?
I think we absolutely, it's an extraordinarily successful story. I mean, considering how small a country it is and how few Greeks there really are on the planet, I'm forever amazed, at how many high-level positions Greeks are in this country and everywhere else. But I mean, Everybody, you turn on the TV, you see Stavridis, you know, on CNN, or, you know, they're everywhere. And you think, how can there be that many Greeks when there are just not that many Greeks in the world? So I think that, as my father used to say, the Greeks don't have to take a back seat to anybody, you know, and I think that's the way I perceive Greek Americans. You know, I'm very proud of my own kids, right, who are continuing at least the name my son is. And my daughter kept her name Metzidakis also, even though she got married to this Chileno that I mentioned before. So I think I'm very proud of being, you know, a Greek anywhere, but in particular in this country, I'm very proud of it because they've done a lot of incredible things over the years.
So as a professor, as an academic, you were connected to other Greek or Greek American professors here in the States or in Greece?
Not much here, but I actually had more of a contact later in my career with this Atiner group in Athens, where I really understood there was a whole Greek intellectual community that I could have been involved in. One of my big regrets is that when I was in college at Princeton, I never really got involved with that Greek community, and it's huge, of course. Keeley and people like that, they were all there. But that was a phase of my life when I was kind of trying to break away a little bit from all this Greek stuff that I had been given. You know, my brothers, and you as a sociologist will appreciate this, my brothers and myself, we would all go around saying, I want to be American, I want to be American, right? It's not an unusual story. Most immigrants feel the same way, especially in this country, where there's so much pressure to become Americanized, right? You say, okay, well, yeah, of course, that's what I want to do. But that was a lot easier said than done, you know? For one thing, I realized you can't take this Greek out of me, and why would you want to anyway, you know? But at that time, I sort of felt a little bit like, yeah, I'll stay away from it. So that's why I didn't have much contact with the Greek intellectual community that was here already. But slowly but surely, I sort of got back into it. Again, via the French thing of all things, which was a real paradox, right? I became more Greek the more I became French, which is really weird.
You have a very special case. I mean, your case is a very special case in many ways. Especially what you said about the force to be Americanized, but your first name in the attempt to become more Americanized became more Greek. From Stamatis never became Steve, but became Stamos, and this is very unusual. And since you are an expert in semiotics, tell us about the name a little bit.
That's great. Yeah, that's a whole story. My wife still laughs about it. But so, as I said, this name Stamos is used for the last name of Greeks, but it's as far as I know, I'm the only person in the world with the name Stamo as a first name. And because it was so unusual, because it still is so unusual in the United States, I had to figure out how can I Americanize my name a little bit more. So instead of calling myself Stamo or Stamos, I just decided, like every other American, to get a one syllable, right? Joe, John, whatever. So I became just Stam instead of Stamo. And my big joke at the time, which my wife hates, it's the worst joke in the world, I would say to everybody, yeah, my name is Stamati in Greek. But I said in Greek, it's a lot more common. It's like any Stam, Dick, or Harry, I would say. So that's how people could remember my name. Because, you know, to this day, if I meet somebody down the hall and he says, what's your name? And I say, Stamo. I say, but my friends call me Stam, like Tom, I'd say. And it was only because of that they will remember the name. Otherwise, I'm going to be this like strange Greek guy. So So I've become Stam for most of my brothers call me Stam. My close friends from back then call me Stam. Everybody calls me Stam except my wife, who she's in the background here, and she still calls me Stamo. And everybody who's known me since I've known her calls me Stamo. So that's my semiotic analysis of my name.
So do you experience at any stage of your life some kind of discrimination because of your name, because not only your first name but also your last name is a very typical name from Crete, and it's not an easy name for Americans. But you felt any discrimination in any form?
I did actually 2 times, now that you ask. Once was when I was in 3rd grade in school here in the United States. I think now in retrospect, I think I could say she was probably racist. I had a teacher, a white teacher named Miss Jones, like the quintessential American name, right? Or English name. Miss Jones couldn't pronounce my name. So she used to call me Santos, which my kids think is the funniest thing in the world, because of course now that one of us is married to a Spanish speaker, there's not Santos, but they still call me Santos to make fun. But so I'm convinced, and she didn't like me. And I think part of the reason she didn't like me is that I was just too foreign for her. Even though my English was perfect and everything, and I was a good student, even in 3rd grade. She didn't like me. I remember she was, I thought, very mean to me on many occasions. Once she told me to stop talking, and she slapped a big stick that she had to point to the blackboard. She slapped it on my desk to tell me to stop talking, but my hand was there. And so she hit my hand, and it really hurt. And I sort of remembered that from then on, and we didn't have a good relationship. So that was one case of discrimination. Much later, when I was in France, on many different occasions, I realized that I was being treated not very well by people, even though my French was basically perfect at the time it started. But people didn't treat me all that well. And it was many years later that I realized that in each and every one of those cases, what had happened is that people looked at me and they saw my name, or didn't see my name, but they assumed I was an Arab. And so French racism vis-a-vis Arabs then became an issue for me. I almost to the point where I have to immediately tell people in France that I'm not from North Africa, because they assume that since my French is perfect, that I must have grown up speaking French. And if I look like this, it must be because I'm not from France. So I've actually suffered discrimination, not because I was Greek, but because they mistakenly took my skin color as a sign of my Arab background.
Very interesting. Your academic career, you taught in a university in the Midwest, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How was it, your experience to teach French literature in the American Midwest?
Well, in St. Louis, it was actually quite easy and quite good, because St. Louis historically is a French town. It was part of New France. You know, in fact, I'm writing a book now about French America. And the way the French came in and went up to, you know, where Quebec is now, and down to St. Lawrence and down through the Great Lakes, all the way down to Louisiana, there was, in the 18th century, even the 17th century, there were French people already there. And so they named it St. Louis for the French background. And so there was always a big Alliance Française There was always a French community in St. Louis that had been there for quite a while. It was eventually superseded by German culture, because as you know, there were so many German immigrants who came in the 19th century. And so most of the Midwest, I think there are more German background people in the Midwest than any other ethnic group. So that I always felt a little bit like a fish out of water out there as a result. You know, I would go into like a baseball game or a football game and look around and say to my wife, everybody in here looks alike except for me. And, you know, some of my neighbors would say the same thing. That never translated as anything bad in the university, however, because the university, because it's much more multicultural and all that, and it was a very liberal place. Of course, I was greeted in a way that I wasn't outside of the university. But it didn't take me long. If I would just leave St. Louis, if I would go even 15, 20 miles outside of St. Louis and went into like the rural areas, I was in a much different place. And that's true still. You know, all of these QAnon and Trump kind of supporters, they're still there very much in Missouri. And so you have to, when you're in the Midwest, my strategy always was to sort of bounce from one big city to another, you know, Chicago or Kansas City or Indianapolis, because outside of those places, you were very much in kind of a cultural desert where people's politics and mine did not jibe at all. So it was, to answer the question, I mean, teaching there was fine as long as I was on the campus and as long as I was in these kind of bubbles. But when I went outside of them, yeah, the other thing I could say is that once I was having a picnic outside, about an hour outside of St. Louis in the Ozarks, and a truck pulled up next to where my family, my little kids and my wife were having a picnic. And inside the truck, it was like, you know, Deliverance, like the movie Deliverance. There were these three guys and they had shotguns in their truck. And they were looking at me and looking at my wife, who's extremely white, right? And this was the middle of July and I was extremely dark. And they just sat there looking at me and us. And I realized at a certain point, this is a little uncomfortable, we should leave. So that kind of is the third example of what you were asking about before. I learned very quickly that the Midwest was fine if you were in the right place, but if you weren't, you know, you probably better be careful. So, you know, and again, that's a terrible generalization. I hate to say that about a huge area, but I think it's true about a lot.
Yes, and the geography of your students, they were forced. It was a mandatory course or it was an elective course. How you managed to have students in your courses?
Well, we had this wonderful for the elementary level. We had this wonderful method that I was talking to you about before, the Rasias method, named after John Rasias, the Greek, who teaches at Dartmouth. I think he's dead now. And anyway, we imported his methodology to teach, which is much more lively, much more communicative. Instead of, you know, learning the imperfect subjunctive of some bizarre verb, they teach you how to speak immediately. You know, how to say, open the door, close the door, you know, give me this or that. And this technique is both fun and effective. And so we started using that in our elementary classes. And when I was a beginning assistant professor, of course, I taught on that level. And so a lot of our success came from turning young kids on to the language thanks to this method. And a lot of those kids then continued to take French, even though there was no language requirement. And they became majors, and then we had a year abroad program or summer abroad program. I ran both of those at different times in my career. And as a result, we had a lot of students of that, a wonderful graduate program that was supported by national funding. And a lot of my best PhD students came from France or other countries. Vicky, who is a friend of ours, a mutual friend, she was one of my students. She's from Greece, but she has graduate degrees from France. And I had a lot of my best graduate students were native French people who, for one reason or other, came to the United States and got accepted at Washington University. And so, you know, those students were TAs a lot of times. And so there was a very lively, a lively French presence on the campus and in the whole city, with a good number of people who wanted to speak French, you know, celebrate French things and retain the whole history of the region, which was, as I say, originally French before it was English or German or anything else.
It is, I don't know if it is a stereotype, but Americans are considered that we are heavily or notoriously monolingual. Is this the case, or we start expanding learning? And also your experience about translation. Overall, it's an Anglophone environment, and very little foreign literature has been translated into English. Is this the case? What is your experience on that?
Yeah, I'm afraid that there's not good news in that regard. I think that we're becoming more monolingual all the time. I mean, you hear young students who say they don't really need to learn another language because everybody speaks English. You know, well, that's not the way to look at it. You know, I mean, everybody knows that in everybody's language there are expressions like "he speaks my language," which doesn't have to do necessarily with the actual linguistic entity that's called a language. It has to do with the way you think, right? The way you see the world. He speaks my language. So what if you could also add to that general figurative sense a literal sense to actually speak that other language? I mean, I think that's what Americans have to get back to. And instead of going, you know, only away from foreign languages, we should be going back into them. Spanish, of course, is overwhelmed all foreign language instruction here just because of demographics. I mean, we can't do much about that. But at Washington University, we actually had more people enrolled in the French department and in the undergrad and graduate programs than Spanish up until maybe 10 years ago. And that was a real outlier. That was a real exception, because that kind of, you know, difference had changed years before in most other places in the country. So I'm glad that the French component, you know, kept itself alive as long as it did. And it's still there. Again, but not nearly as well supported as the Spanish stuff that's going on in my university and other American universities. I think that's a shame.
Yeah. One thing that came out of the pandemic is that the way we teach somehow has been changed now, right? With of course, it affected other aspects of our lives, right? How we work, the concept of work. But as far as concerned teaching, the technology plays a significant role. Do you think that this is the future of education through technology, Zoom or Blackboard teaching?
I think
or in person and in classroom and study abroad is you know, the only way or the best way?
I think we are going towards that technology more and more, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for all the reasons I said before, which is that you really need to get into somebody else's culture and language. You can't do it some other way. There's no fancy way of doing it. I've been reading recently that I think it was at Princeton, in fact, that I read that in the classics department there now is thinking of not requiring Greek anymore or Latin. I'm going, that'd be like, and I know that that's already true in some French departments where you can get you could be in a graduate seminar and it's all in English. I'm going, how is this possible? Or people, we also read about Harvard not too long ago in their English department, a professor apparently said in an article in the New York Times something like 50% of the English majors at Harvard haven't read Shakespeare. So, you know, this is a slightly different topic, but it's part of the same move away from canonical things, right? The canon would have you believe that the language is the number one thing to learn, you know, and the greatest examples of that language are the things you need to study. But, you know, that's not what's going on now. Now it's everybody sort of should have an equal say about things, which sounds good, you know, and I'm all for pluralism and all the rest. But I think that there are some downsides to it, where people can think that certain things maybe are less important than others. Whereas I think in an ideal world, there has to be some sense of priority. You know, what is more important to study now? What is it more important that you know? You know, all the other stuff, you know, it's all fine and good. We could talk about it and do stuff, but let's teach stuff that's primary first. You know, that's the fundamental stuff. Let's teach that first, and then we could get to everything else. I mean, we could have a long discussion, obviously, about this and how.
Yes, the whole cancel culture that exists nowadays, right?
Yes.
I mean, to ban Homer from certain schools, or to ban other scientific, you know, discoveries in certain areas of the country that they don't teach the theory of evolution, right? So.
Yeah, right.
The cancel theory is very skeptical. But let's talk about your books. I remember when I got your first book on the French semiotics and literature that was interesting because French poetry plays a significant role in our intellectual development, Baudelaire or Rimbaud and others. So let's talk about some of your books. Tell us about this first book of yours.
Well, the first book was about how do we read prose poems? Because as you know, the whole idea of a prose poem is a paradox, right? How can a poem be prose, or how can prose be poetry? But in the 19th century, Baudelaire and Rimbaud in particular really perfected the idea of a prose poem. And so I wrote a book about how can we interpret this stuff? You know, how does one make sense out of a paradoxical genre? And I studied those two plus André Breton, the founder of Surrealism. All three sets of prose poems I used to sort of come up with a general theory of reading, like how do we read anything? And the idea was that the prose poem was like a degree zero of literariness, of something that we could call literariness or poeticity, which is a linguistic concept by Jacobson and Chomsky and people like that in linguistics. So my idea was to come up with a basic typology of different parts of a text that we read according to basically the number of times we see things repeated in each of these categories. So the two basic divisions that I used in the typology was between intertextual repetitions and intratextual repetitions. So my idea is that in order for you to understand any text, you have to eventually relate it to something that we already know. You know, it's like language. I can't say to you blah, 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 unless you know what that's referring to, right? So there's a model and there's a copy. And so I was studying all the ways that prose poems could function like that. How we would read a poem and a prose poem and know that it was referring to something else intertextually. Now, at the same time, there's an intratextual dimension, which means that within a text, any literary text, there are other kinds of repetitions, you know, like rhymes or images or themes. They're repeated within the text. So those are the two categories that I came up with in this book. And within those categories, there are different levels, you know, the text as a whole, all the way down to repeated letters and accent marks, which I tried to show can also be significant. Like if you're talking about a poem, if you're in a poem, if you're describing an oyster in French, okay, and you use the word huître, which has a circumflex accent, that hat, and you suddenly discover that every sentence has a word in it that has that symbol, then you have to ask yourself, as Francis Ponge did, who's a 20th century French poet, why did I do that? Why did I put all these words with that? You say, well, because it's like an oyster, right? Because the accent looks like an oyster. So if you study anything that's repeated in a text, you can eventually, in many cases, bring it back to something everybody understands. And if you can do that, well, then you're basically in the process of interpreting a piece of literature. So that's what the first book was about. The second book was about difference and about pluralism, I mentioned before. I basically wanted to study how did the political and sociological notion of pluralism get infused into literary studies and into literature itself. And basically, the basic argument is that at the end of the 18th century, in particular, right, with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the whole democratic, republican effort to get rid of the monarchy, get rid of the vertical power on top and everybody else on the bottom model, and make it democratic, right? Let's give power to the people and all that. It started basically then in politics and other areas. Well, what were the effects in literature? How did that translate into literature? One way it did, as I show in the book, is there was suddenly an explosion of different literary genres, like the prose poem. The prose poem is an example itself. But there are all these different types of theatrical conventions that are changed. You know, Victor Hugo, he rewrites 17th century classic neoclassical theater. He changes the way, you know, the syllables can work, the rhymes can work. He puts new vocabulary in that you're not supposed to use before the 19th century, right? They're bad words or inappropriate words, according to a classical aesthetic, right? So basically my study in that book about difference is that my basic idea is that difference was left like completely open, like it was suddenly hyper emphasized. Instead of imitation, like imitating the classics and copying the greatest works, suddenly everybody was trying to do his or her own thing. In other words, the most important thing became doing something original. So I sort of conflate the idea of originality and difference and novelty and connect it to pluralism by saying that in criticism, the pluralism I'm talking about translates into a desire to have more and more interpretations of the same works. And you know full well that that continues in our time. There's never enough commentary on Victor Hugo or on Baudelaire. There's always another book to be written. And it's almost, where did this idea come from? You know, that one more title, one more reading of Hamlet is important. I once gave a talk called Excuse me 1 second. Two kinds of pluralism that I broke that up into is critical pluralism or aesthetic pluralism. The aesthetic meant writers starting at that time, at the end of the 18th century, started introducing new kinds of characters, introducing new kinds of plots, new kinds of genre. That was the aesthetic part. The critical part became important in the sense that there was this attempt at coming up with newer and newer interpretations of things, and that everything you could do to try to bring, you know, a new reading, an original reading, a different reading of something, everything that you could do would be a good thing. There was this general sense that, you know, the more we produce, the better. So that's how it's connected to capitalism too, right? This whole productive, it's all about production. We just
growth, growth.
Producing more literature, more readings of literature. So that's why I studied this phenomenon historically. I never said, the way some reviewers mistook, I never said that I was against pluralism or that I was against the idea of asserting one's difference. On the contrary, I said, no, that's all very good. It's just that we should be very careful when we make a big deal out of how something is different from something else, or how this is original when it really isn't very original. I'm just trying to make people a little bit more modest and a little bit more attentive to what is really different or not different. What is truly original and what's a copy, you know, or an imitation. Because I think there's a lot more of that than people realize. The last book was about French poetry in general, and that was co-written. I was the editor and also the co-author. That's sort of that's broken up chronologically. So there are studies of French poetry from the Middle Ages to the present. So that's a little bit more varied. It's probably not too much to talk about there, except to send people to to that book. It's called Essays for a New Millennium, Understanding French Poetry. The two books I'm working on now, one has to do with the history of the French in North America for like over a 500-year period. And the other has to do with visual aspects of French literature. I was referring to that before about the oyster, the word for huître, which is oyster in French. So yeah, that's pretty much. I'm still writing comparative things too. I have a long article about Lanthimos' cinema, his recent films. I wrote a big article in the Journal of Modern Greek Studies a couple of years ago about Dogtooth, right? Kinodondas. And so now I've written about the film since then, like once he became a really famous director now with The Favorite and all these other movies. So I have a long article about that hopefully will be coming out shortly. So just diaphora pramata, you know, different things to different areas.
I hope we also write something about Roviro Manthuli, who was also in France, because he was the junta was after him, you know, in France. And when he came to the States, he did a documentary for the French TV for the American blues. So we see. But what is your experience? Do you think that Greek Americans are readers? They read, or the Americans are listening into French literature? Do they read? Do they buy books?
Do the Greek Americans? Is that what you're asking?
One question is about the Greek Americans. If you think it is an ethnic group that likes to read or has access to books?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah, I think they do tend to read a little bit more widely than a lot of other Americans do, for sure. Um, the community I grew up in was, I would say, mostly middle to upper middle class. And so there was always a huge emphasis on education of all types. But whether or not they actually read or read more than their American counterparts, I'm not sure I can answer that. Not sure I know.
But the Americans, do they read French literature?
Do Americans read it? Yeah, yes, they do, but probably not nearly as much as they should. Americans, as we said, tend to be monolinguistic, and anything that's outside of their own experience, they don't tend to read. But they do read a lot of stuff in translation. And living in a place like New York, it's hard to generalize because people here do just read a lot more and a lot more varied literature. I think that the popular literature that's so important in America is probably not nearly as important in my opinion as it should be, or rather than it is. Excuse me, I'm not sure who this is. I'm going to just let that ring. Sorry.
Yeah. And also, what you said before about the oyster thing and how you make the connections. For me, the last European philosopher was a Wittgenstein.
Yes.
And, among the various things that he has stated, and I think has been very oft quoted and probably misunderstood, that the boundaries of my world are the boundaries of my language.
So exactly.
How language also creates a certain set of thinking, and therefore, the more we translate, the more we expand our boundaries, right? This is your close to your argument, right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, there's no doubt that's so important, for sure. The translation is, I just translated a book-length manuscript by Paul Gauguin, the artist. It's never been translated before. I was hired by the St. Louis Art Museum to do this translation because they had their hands on this manuscript. And it's just so fascinating to me to be, translating this into English now for the first time. I realized this is a tremendously important piece of literature, not just for art historians, but for anybody who's interested in that time period. So yeah, I mean, translation has to be done. The only problem I have with translation is that it's all too easy for some people to say, well, I'll just read the translation, and then they don't go any farther than that. I think that's a mistake. I think they should try their hardest. If we can get more bilingual editions, that's great. Like I did that with Dante's Inferno. I know a little bit of Italian, not a lot, but enough so that I could really appreciate reading the English here and the Italian there. And I think that's what people should do much more.
Do you read Greek authors?
Well, yeah, I mean, besides Kazantzakis, who I always love, I'm actually starting to read things in translation. I just read Omikros Pringipas, believe it or not, in Greek, because I found it in Athens the last time I was there. So
Anton Exupéry's classic, yes.
Right,
yes.
right. And Oxenos by Camus. I'm also reading that in Greek. So, but actually, like for modern day authors, I really just don't know them. I'm hoping to get around to that eventually. So we'll see what happens.
So one of the things that we discuss within the Greek American community is the issue of voting. So Greeks who live in America to have a chance, instead of traveling to Greece in order to vote in the national elections, to be able to vote from where they are, as the French do actually, right?
Yes.
They go to a consul general and vote.
Right.
What is your opinion about that, about voting Greek elections?
Well, I think it's very important for Greeks to be able to do that from abroad. The diaspora being so important that there are so many, shall we say, well-to-do or successful Greeks abroad, that it's just crazy that they can't. Are you saying that right now they can't vote from abroad?
No, they have to travel. They have to go out.
They have to go. Yeah, yeah. I think that's crazy. I would be definitely for giving, you know, people who are outside of the borders every bit the same chance to vote as anybody else. I mean, you're definitely part of the same entity, so why wouldn't you have that chance? You know, seems unfair to me.
So, what is your advice as an experienced academic if a young professor wants to start now and teach, you know, build a career on a language, either this is French or another language? What is your advice to a young professor who wants to teach?
That is a real tough question, because there's a part of me that would say, don't do it. Don't go into this area. But there's another part of me that, of course, wants to encourage people as much as possible. The only reason I would say don't do it is that the way the American government's working these days, I don't think there's going to be much support for the humanities in general, and especially not for languages unless it's Spanish or something practical. Everybody's thinking in terms of practical, you know, the suitability of the discipline. Like, we have to explain ourselves, you know, why do you do what you do? There used to be a pretty simple explanation for that, or answer. The answer used to be, just because it's important to get you to think properly and critically and to know things for the sake of knowing things. That doesn't work with a lot of legislatures anymore. They're not interested in that. They want to know, can this translate into a job? So when you ask, how would I encourage them or not? I encourage people to study what I have been teaching all these years, but I also encourage them to keep their mind very open as to other possibilities, so that they don't all have to necessarily become university professors. They don't all have to become teachers on a lower level. They can try to use their translation skills in different industries. They can try to take their knowledge of literature and do other kinds of jobs, writing jobs, you know, and all the rest. So there are a lot of skills that you learn, the critical skills, the research skills that you learn along the way that can be used for other things. So my advice basically would be, and continues to be, if you really love this subject, study it. Don't worry about anything else. Do what you really feel you want to do. Learn what you want to learn, because things will work out in the long run. You know, don't go into a lot of debt. I would say that also, because now it's crazy. People I mean, I had a student, and this was almost 20 years ago, a comp lit PhD, who had like $45,000 in debt coming out with her PhD in comp lit. This was in maybe 1995. And I thought at that time, that's an unbelievable debt. How is she going to pay that? You know, she was not going to get paid more than like $30,000 at $25,000, $30,000 a year at that time. And she had that kind of debt. So I definitely say, stay away from anything that's going to put you into a big financial hole. But other than that, do what you really want to do, study what you really want to do, and keep your mind open to all the options that are out there, given what you want to study.
And as far as concerns the Greek American community, in your case, your family goes back 100 years ago, right? So you see, there is a continuous presence. How do you see the future of Greeks in America? Since the language is among the early things that we're losing. Yeah. So it will be a continuity, it's going to be an alternative mode and an alternative form of Greekness. How do you see that?
You know, that's a very tough nut to crack. I don't know if there's any solution, because I watched the same thing happen like in places like Louisiana, where people have lost their French, right? There are all these organizations trying to develop French in those bayou communities. But when you're surrounded by English in every possible sphere of your life, it's really hard to keep a different language going, a different culture going, unless you have some place where you can meet regularly and sort of participate together in this thing. And that place is obvious. It's the church again. It's the church or some sort of community center, or both, right? Where you have all your activities connected to that. I don't know if that's feasible these days. I don't know if there's too much moving around. People move for jobs, people move for other reasons. Even Greek Americans who are here now could be 1,000 miles away tomorrow. So how do you develop that community? I mean, that's a big question that has a lot to do with all immigrants, right? Not just Greek Americans. Greek Americans probably ask the question more because we're much more proud, perhaps, of our culture. But who's not proud, right? Who's not proud of something that they were given, from some previous generation? So it just seems to me that you have to come up with some meeting place, some regular meeting place for the Greek culture and language to continue and to keep growing and to keep attracting people. So I'm thinking maybe in my old age, now that I didn't do all of the things that I could have done with my own kids, maybe I'll sort of go back and try to somehow help, foster this whole Greek thing much more amongst my now grandkids, right? My egonakia and my kids now that they're grown up and they don't have to worry about what other people think is odd about them or unusual about them.
So you still continue identify yourself as Greek or partially Greek. Greece means something special to you, right? As a country, as a culture, right?
Absolutely. I mean, who's more worthy of being proud than Greeks, right?
Excellent. Dr. Stamati Metzidakis, thank you very much for giving this very interesting interview to the Hellenic American Project and at Queen's College CUNY. And I think the main thing that you bring today is what you said about advising young people, do what you really wish to do, what you love to do, be careful of certain things. And as far as concerned, the Greek aspect is that we look in our past, but also trying to make sense of the present, right? So this is very interesting connection that you made. And of course, the love of reading in more than one languages. I think this is a fundamental, point that you made here today. I remember my grandmother saying that the more languages you learn, the more human you become. So we add human lives in one additional language that we learn and understand.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nico. And hopefully we'll get to meet you in person here shortly.
Absolutely. We're both here in New York.
Yes, absolutely.
Or we can always meet in Paris.
There we go. We'll always have Paris. No, we're going to Los Angeles because Cadena lives out there now. So we're going to go visit their family for a couple of months. But when I come back, are you going to be around in September?
Yes, of course.
I will contact you. We should go out and have a cup of coffee or something, pure nostimo.
Very good. I know a very nice French bistro here in Astoria. So.
Good. Okay. Well, we'll plan to meet there. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Nase kala.
Bye. Yeah.
Yasu.